Imagine how many times you've seen those black and white documentaries about World War II, narrated with absolute certainty. Good afternoon, you're watching 33 Facts. Here we tell you amazing stories, scientific misconceptions, and unexplained facts. Get comfortable. Let's begin. First deceptive fact, the idea that Germany had the most powerful military in the world when the war started. We've all heard this. Propaganda films, history books, documentaries, they all paint the same picture. The unstoppable Wehrmacht, rolling across Europe with unprecedented force. But here's what rarely gets mentioned. France actually had more tanks than Germany in 1940. Not just slightly more, significantly more. The French had around 3,000 tanks. Germany had about 2,500. And French tanks weren't inferior either. The Char B1 was better armoured and better armed than most German tanks at the time. Britain and France combined had more aircraft than Germany. So why did France fall in 6 weeks? It wasn't superior German numbers or technology. It was strategy, communication, and doctrine. The Germans concentrated their forces at key points. The French spread theirs along the entire border. German tanks operated in coordinated divisions with air support. French tanks were dispersed among infantry units. The myth of overwhelming German military superiority was partly German propaganda and partly French excuse-making after the defeat. Reality was far more complicated. But wait, here's another layer to this. Second deceptive fact, that Hitler's forces swept through Europe because of some revolutionary new warfare called Blitzkrieg. The term sounds impressive. Lightning war. Rapid, coordinated attacks combining tanks, aircraft, and infantry. Except Hitler and the German military command never officially used this term during the war. It was coined by Western journalists trying to explain what happened. And while German tactics were effective, they weren't entirely new. Similar concepts of mobile warfare, deep penetration, and combined arms had been discussed by military theorists for years, including French and British officers. The Germans just implemented these ideas better in 1940, but after the war, Blitzkrieg became this mythical German invention, this unstoppable military revolution. In reality, German success came from better training, better communication systems, better coordination between branches, and opponents who were unprepared for the pace of modern warfare. By 1941 and 42, once the Soviets and Western allies adapted, the Blitzkrieg suddenly stopped being so unstoppable. The myth persisted because it made for a better story than admitting that France and other countries simply failed to prepare adequately. And here's what's interesting. Third deceptive fact, the widespread belief that Britain stood completely alone against Nazi Germany. Their finest hour, right? Just Britain and the Commonwealth against the Nazi war machine. It makes for an inspiring narrative. Winston Churchill's speeches reinforce this image. And yes, after France fell, Britain was the last major power in Western Europe still fighting. But alone, not exactly. Britain had the entire resources of its global empire behind it. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and dozens of colonies contributed troops, resources, and industrial capacity. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa, Burma, and Italy, over 2 million of them. Canadian pilots defended British skies. Australian forces held the line in the Middle East. The Soviet Union was fighting Germany on the Eastern Front from June 1941 onward, tying down the vast majority of German forces. The United States was providing massive material support through Lend-Lease, even before officially entering the war. Britain was the last unconquered major power in Western Europe, yes, but the idea of splendid isolation standing utterly alone is more poetry than history. Now attention. Fourth deceptive fact, that the Dunkirk evacuation was a triumph. 340,000 soldiers rescued from the beaches in 9 days, the little ships sailing across the Channel. It's been romanticized endlessly, most recently in Christopher Nolan's film. And yes, getting those men off the beach was a remarkable feat of improvisation and courage. But militarily, it was a disaster. The British Expeditionary Force abandoned virtually all its heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, supplies, left behind. Britain's army was saved but essentially disarmed. It would take years to rebuild that capability. The French forces left behind felt abandoned, deepening the rift between the Allies. The Germans captured or destroyed enormous quantities of British military hardware. Churchill himself called it a colossal military disaster in his speech to Parliament, though that part is quoted less often than his more inspiring words. The evacuation prevented total catastrophe, but calling it a triumph meant ignoring the magnitude of the defeat that made it necessary. But there's a nuance. Fifth deceptive fact: the claim that the Battle of Britain was won primarily by Spitfires and the skill of RAF fighter pilots. The Spitfire has become iconic. Sleek, beautiful, deadly. Every documentary shows them wheeling through the sky, dogfighting with Messerschmitts. And yes, RAF pilots were skilled and brave, but here's what changed the battle: radar. Britain's chain-home radar system gave advance warning of incoming German raids. Controllers could vector fighters to intercept bombers before they reached their targets. Without radar, British fighters would have been flying blind, burning fuel on fruitless patrols, getting caught on the ground during refueling. The Germans didn't fully understand how crucial British radar was. They bombed some stations but never systematically targeted the radar network. That failure was decisive. Also, there were more Hawker Hurricanes than Spitfires during the battle, and Hurricanes actually shot down more German aircraft. But the Hurricane was less glamorous, so it got written out of the popular narrative. The battle was won by technology, intelligence, and logistics as much as by pilot skill. And here's another moment. Sixth deceptive fact: that Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union failed primarily because of winter weather and vast distances. General Winter and General Space defeated Hitler. It's the standard explanation. The German army, unprepared for Russian winter, froze outside Moscow. The distances exhausted their supply lines. Both factors mattered, certainly, but this explanation lets the German military off the hook. It suggests they would have won if not for bad luck and geography. Reality: the Red Army fought back ferociously from day one. Soviet resistance was far stronger than German planning anticipated. The Wehrmacht took massive casualties throughout the summer and autumn of 1941, long before winter set in. Soviet counterattacks disrupted German timetables. Partisan warfare behind German lines harassed supply columns. German logistics were inadequate from the start. They relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, not enough trucks. The Soviet Union's industrial base, much of it relocated east of the Urals, kept producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons even as Western territories fell. Winter and distance were challenges, but the real reason Operation Barbarossa failed was that the Germans underestimated Soviet military capability, industrial resilience, and willingness to fight. Blaming the weather is easier than admitting you were beaten by a determined enemy. Now the most curious part. Seventh deceptive fact: the idea that Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise that caught America totally off guard. December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. The story we know. Japanese carriers approach undetected, launch a devastating surprise attack. America jolted into the war. But was it really such a shock? American intelligence had broken Japanese diplomatic codes. They knew war was likely. The question was, where and when? Warnings were sent to Pacific commanders, though they were vague. A radar station in Hawaii actually detected the incoming Japanese aircraft, but was told not to worry about it. They assumed it was American planes. Diplomatic relations between the US and Japan had been deteriorating for months. America had imposed oil embargoes. War seemed probable. What surprised American commanders was that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor specifically rather than targets in Southeast Asia. The tactical surprise was real. The attack came earlier on a Sunday morning than expected. But the strategic surprise? That's been exaggerated. After the war, emphasizing total surprise helped explain how such damage occurred and deflected questions about whether commanders had been negligent. If you're enjoying our videos about amazing facts, myths, and bold exposure of lies, support us with a like and write the number 1 in the comments. If you're not feeling it, put a 0. That way we'll understand what interests you and make even better episodes. And here's what raises questions. 8th deceptive fact: that Japanese Americans were interned because of legitimate security concerns. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them American citizens, forcibly relocated to camps. The official justification was military necessity, fear of sabotage and espionage on the West Coast. But here's what we know now. Not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of sabotage or espionage during the war. Not one. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said there was no evidence of a security threat from Japanese Americans and opposed mass internment. Military commanders in Hawaii, where the actual attack happened and where over 150,000 people of Japanese ancestry lived, more than a third of the population, did not implement mass internment. Why? Because it would have crippled the Hawaiian economy. On the mainland, economic interests also played a role. White farmers and business owners saw an opportunity to eliminate Japanese-American competitors. Racism was a huge factor. German Americans and Italian Americans weren't interned en masse despite America being at war with Germany and Italy. Years later, the US government formally apologized and paid reparations, acknowledging that internment was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The security justification was a cover story. Now let's go deeper. Ninth deceptive fact: the narrative that D-Day succeeded primarily because of Allied bravery storming the beaches. Omaha Beach. The scenes are etched in popular memory. Soldiers wading through water under withering fire, scaling cliffs, overwhelming German defenses through sheer courage. It's a powerful image. And yes, the soldiers were brave. But D-Day succeeded primarily because of deception. Operation Fortitude convinced the Germans that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The Allies created an entire fake army, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and double agents feeding false information. Even after the Normandy landings began, German high command believed it was a diversion. They held back armoured divisions near Calais, waiting for the real invasion. By the time they realized their mistake, the Allies had established a foothold. German air power had been systematically destroyed before D-Day. Allied naval superiority ensured reinforcements and supplies kept flowing. The paratroop drops, though chaotic, confused German defenders and disrupted communications. Weather played a role too. The Germans didn't think an invasion was possible in those conditions. The beach landings were the visible, dramatic part, but the invasion succeeded because of months of planning, intelligence operations, air superiority, and strategic deception. But wait, here's another version. 10th deceptive fact: that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to end the war and avoid a costly invasion of Japan. This is one of the most contentious issues. The standard narrative: Japan would fight to the bitter end. An invasion would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and even more Japanese lives. The bombs, while terrible, were the lesser evil. But several high-ranking American military leaders disagreed. General Dwight Eisenhower said the Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Admiral William Leahy called it barbarism and said Japan was already defeated. The US Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that Japan would have surrendered before November 1945, even without the bombs, the Soviet entry into the war, or an invasion. Soviet declaration of war on Japan came between the two atomic bombs, and some historians argue that this, eliminating any hope of Soviet mediation, was more decisive than the bombs themselves. Other historians suggest the bombs were dropped partially to demonstrate American power to the Soviets and justify the massive investment in the Manhattan Project. The truth is complex and debated, but the simple narrative that the bombs unquestionably saved lives is not supported by all the evidence, and this is still not everything. 11th deceptive fact: the idea that concentration camps were unknown to ordinary Germans and the world until the war ended. The shocking revelations when Allied troops liberated the camps. The famous footage and photographs "we didn't know" became the standard German response after the war. But that doesn't hold up. Concentration camps existed in Germany since 1933. Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. They were public knowledge within Germany, used to imprison political opponents, criminals and undesirables. The camps were located near towns and cities. Thousands of Germans worked as guards, administrators, suppliers. The smell from crematoria, the trains packed with prisoners, these things were visible. As for the world, reports about Nazi persecution of Jews circulated throughout the war. The New York Times published hundreds of articles about it. The Allies knew, but they didn't make it a priority. Bombing rail lines to Auschwitz was proposed but rejected. The full extent of the systematic extermination, the industrial-scale murder, was perhaps not fully grasped until liberation. But willful ignorance is not the same as genuine surprise. Many people knew something terrible was happening and chose not to look too closely. Here's the important detail. 12th deceptive fact: that the French resistance was a massive, unified movement fighting German occupation. After liberation, it seemed like everyone in France had been in the resistance. The reality was messier. The resistance was real and brave people risked and lost their lives. But it was small for most of the war, fragmented and politically divided. Communists, Gaullists, socialists, they didn't always cooperate. Many French people neither actively resisted nor collaborated. They just tried to survive. The Vichy government, which controlled southern France until late 1942, collaborated extensively with the Nazis and had significant popular support initially. Marshal Pétain was seen as a hero, the savior of France. Only as German defeat became likely did resistance numbers swell and collaboration become untenable. After the war, France needed a unifying myth. Everyone became a resistant. Collaborators were downplayed or forgotten. Charles de Gaulle promoted the idea that France had liberated itself with Allied help, rather than being liberated by the Allies. It served French national pride but distorted history. And now the most intriguing part: 13th deceptive fact. The claim that Hitler was a strategic genius in the early war years. His generals wanted to be cautious, but Hitler's bold decisions led to victory after victory. France fell. Poland crushed. This narrative emerged partly from post-war German generals' memoirs. They blamed Hitler for Germany's defeat, claiming they would have won if he hadn't interfered. This conveniently absolved them of responsibility. But Hitler's early successes were often reckless gambles that worked because opponents were unprepared or made mistakes. Invading Poland risked war with Britain and France, which happened. Invading France through the Ardennes was risky. If French forces had been positioned differently, it could have been a disaster. Declaring war on the United States after Pearl Harbor was strategically insane, turning a European war into a global one against the world's largest industrial power. His decision to invade the Soviet Union while still fighting Britain was arguably Germany's greatest strategic mistake. Hitler's interference in military operations, forbidding retreats, micromanaging tactics, diverting resources to pet projects, often made things worse. The idea of Hitler as a genius ignores how his decisions ultimately destroyed Germany. Now here's what really stands out. 14th deceptive fact: that Enigma code-breaking at Bletchley Park won the war. The story is dramatic. British mathematicians led by Alan Turing crack the unbreakable German code. Ultra-intelligence gives the Allies a decisive advantage. It's been celebrated in books and films. And yes, Enigma decryption was important. It provided valuable intelligence about German U-boat positions, military movements, and strategic plans. But calling it war-winning overstates the case. The Germans used multiple encryption systems, and Enigma was just one. Not all Enigma traffic could be read all the time. Sometimes the Germans changed settings or procedures, and Bletchley Park lost access for weeks or months. Intelligence is only useful if acted upon correctly, and sometimes it wasn't. The Soviets broke German codes independently and didn't rely on British intelligence. American code breaking against Japan, breaking the Japanese naval code, arguably had a bigger impact in the Pacific. Bletchley Park was a major intelligence success, but wars are won by soldiers, logistics, industrial production, and strategy, not code breaking alone. But there's more to it. 15th deceptive fact: the narrative that the Holocaust was primarily carried out by a small group of Nazi fanatics, while ordinary Germans were innocent. This is the few bad apples theory. Hitler, Himmler, the SS, they were responsible, not regular Germans. But the Holocaust required massive participation. The railway workers who transported millions to death camps, the bureaucrats who organized deportations, the soldiers and policemen who rounded up Jews, the neighbors who informed on hidden families, the business owners who profited from confiscated property. Hundreds of thousands of people were directly involved. Millions more were complicit through silence or indifference. Post-war trials prosecuted only a tiny fraction. Germany's post-war narrative emphasized victimization, German cities bombed, German suffering, rather than confronting widespread complicity. It took decades before German society seriously grappled with collective responsibility. Blaming a small Nazi leadership circle was psychologically easier than acknowledging how deeply ordinary people were implicated. Let's move on. 16th deceptive fact. The idea that the Allies fought a clean moral war while the Axis powers committed all the atrocities. The Allies were the good guys, no question. They were fighting against fascism, against regimes committing genocide. But clean and moral, that's whitewashing. Allied bombing campaigns deliberately targeted civilian populations in German and Japanese cities. Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, firestorms killed tens of thousands of civilians. The justification was breaking enemy morale and industrial capacity, but these were war crimes by today's standards. Soviet forces committed mass rapes and atrocities as they advanced through Eastern Europe. Japanese POWs were sometimes killed rather than taken prisoner in the Pacific. The atomic bombs killed overwhelmingly civilian populations. None of this is equivalent to the Holocaust or Japanese atrocities in China, which were systematic genocides. But the idea that only the Axis committed war crimes is false. War brutalizes everyone involved, and Allied forces committed acts that would be condemned as atrocities in any other context. And here's what surprises. 17th deceptive fact. The belief that Germany was militarily superior and only lost because of being outnumbered. The clean Wehrmacht myth. If only Germany had more resources, better allies, or made different decisions, they could have won. This ignores fundamental realities. Germany's economy was smaller than the combined Allied economies. Germany lacked strategic resources. Oil, rubber, certain metals. German industry, while advanced in some areas, couldn't match Allied production. In 1944, the US alone produced more aircraft than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The Soviet Union outproduced Germany in tanks. Britain's economy, supported by its empire and American aid, sustained a long war. Germany's strategic position was hopeless once it faced Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously. The idea that Germans were better soldiers who only lost through being overwhelmed is comforting to those who don't want to credit Allied fighting ability, industrial capacity, and strategic planning. Germany didn't lose because of bad luck. It lost because the Allies were stronger. This is where it gets really interesting. 18th deceptive fact, that Mussolini's Italy was a significant military power and valuable German ally. Italy is often mocked in World War II narratives, the incompetent partner who constantly needed German rescue. And yes, Italian military performance was often poor. Defeats in Greece, North Africa, East Africa. But this narrative is also unfair and misleading. Italian soldiers often fought with outdated equipment, poor logistics, and incompetent leadership. When properly led and equipped, Italian units could fight effectively. The real problem was that Mussolini dragged Italy into a war it wasn't prepared for. Italy's economy couldn't support a major war effort. Its industrial base was weak compared to other major powers. Mussolini's ambitions exceeded Italy's capabilities. Blaming Italian soldiers for failures created by political and strategic incompetence is misplaced. And from Germany's perspective, Italy wasn't worthless as an ally. Italian forces tied down Allied troops in the Mediterranean. Italy's entry into the war opened new fronts that stretched Allied resources. The narrative of Italy as purely a burden oversimplifies a complex military relationship. Now pay attention. 19th deceptive fact. The claim that the war in the Pacific was primarily an American effort. The United States played a huge role, absolutely. Island-hopping campaigns, the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal, MacArthur and Nimitz, the atomic bombs. American actions dominate the narrative. But this erases other participants. Chinese forces fought Japan from 1937 to 1945, tying down massive Japanese armies that otherwise could have been deployed elsewhere. Over 15 million Chinese died. British and Commonwealth forces fought in Burma, defending India and eventually pushing Japanese forces back. Australian forces fought in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Soviet forces crushed the Japanese army in Manchuria in August 1945 in a devastating campaign. The American-centric narrative reflects American sources, American films, American history books. But the Pacific War involved multiple allied nations, and China especially paid an enormous price that often gets footnoted in Western accounts. And another moment emerges, 20th deceptive fact, that radar-equipped night fighters and flak guns defeated the German bombing campaign against Britain during the Blitz. The heroic image, searchlights sweeping the sky, anti-aircraft guns blazing, fighters scrambling to intercept. The defences held. But actually, German bombers mostly stopped because Hitler redirected them east for the invasion of the Soviet Union. British defences shot down some German aircraft, but losses weren't prohibitive. German bombing did terrible damage, over 40,000 British civilians killed, but didn't break morale or cripple industry. The Luftwaffe never had enough bombers for a sustained strategic campaign anyway. The Blitz ended primarily for strategic reasons, not because British defences made it impossible, but the narrative of defences defeating the bombing made better propaganda than admitting the Germans simply chose to bomb someone else instead. Here comes the unexpected twist. 21st deceptive fact: the idea that the Nazis were efficient, organised and ran a well-oiled machine. We picture jack-booted precision, ruthless efficiency, German engineering. Reality, Nazi Germany was a bureaucratic nightmare. Overlapping agencies, competing power centres, unclear chains of command. Hitler encouraged this chaos because it kept subordinates competing for his favour rather than threatening his position. Different organisations would pursue contradictory policies. Resources were wasted on grandiose projects that had no military value. The Holocaust itself, horrifyingly, was inefficient. It diverted resources, railway capacity and manpower from the war effort for the sake of genocide. German war production didn't reach full mobilization until 1943 or 44, years into the war. Albert Speer somewhat rationalized production, but even then it was plagued by inefficiencies. The image of Nazi Germany as a perfectly organized totalitarian state is propaganda, both theirs and ours. The reality was messier and in some ways more disturbing. A dysfunctional system capable of terrible things. This detail changes everything. 22nd deceptive fact that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to destroy the American Pacific Fleet and prevent American interference with Japanese expansion. That's the textbook explanation. Destroy the battleships, and America can't stop Japan from conquering Southeast Asia for resources, especially oil. But here's the problem with that plan. It was strategically incoherent. America was never going to accept Japan conquering the Pacific. Even with the fleet damaged, American industrial capacity meant it could rebuild. All the attack did was guarantee American entry into the war with total commitment to Japan's defeat. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually said that is disputed, but the sentiment was accurate. Some historians suggest the attack was more about Japanese military culture, the idea of a decisive battle striking the first blow, than rational strategy. Japan's military leadership believed in willpower and fighting spirit overcoming material disadvantage. It was a gamble based on hope that America would seek a negotiated peace rather than fight a long war. That bet was catastrophically wrong. Let's look at the next point. 23rd deceptive fact: the belief that the Yalta Conference sold out Eastern Europe to Stalin. The image, a sick Roosevelt manipulated by a cunning Stalin, betraying Poland and other nations to Soviet domination. Churchill powerless to stop it. This narrative became popular during the Cold War, especially among conservatives criticizing Roosevelt. But what were the actual alternatives? By February 1945, when Yalta happened, Soviet troops already occupied most of Eastern Europe. They had driven the Germans back at enormous cost. The Red Army had done the bulk of the fighting and dying. The Western Allies had no military leverage to force Stalin out of territories his armies controlled. Starting a war with the Soviet Union was unthinkable. The Western Allies and Soviets were still fighting Germany together. The agreements at Yalta actually included promises of free elections in Eastern Europe, which Stalin later violated. Roosevelt and Churchill secured Soviet agreement to join the war against Japan and to participate in the United Nations. Criticizing Yalta is easy in hindsight, but given the military realities in February 1945, the Western Allies had limited options to prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. And here's what's usually not mentioned. 24th deceptive fact that the German military was apolitical and professionally opposed to Nazi ideology. The clean Wehrmacht myth again. After the war, German generals claimed they were just soldiers following orders, not Nazis, not involved in atrocities. This was useful during the Cold War when West Germany became an ally and former Wehrmacht officers were needed for the new West German military. But it's false. Wehrmacht forces participated in atrocities on the Eastern Front. They cooperated with SS killing squads. Military orders explicitly called for harsh treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians. Millions of Soviet POWs died in German custody through deliberate starvation and neglect. Wehrmacht soldiers committed rapes and massacres. Senior officers were often Nazi party members or sympathizers. The idea of a professional, apolitical military was a post-war fabrication that served both German rehabilitation and Cold War needs. It took decades of historical research to demolish this myth and show how deeply the Wehrmacht was complicit in Nazi crimes. There's a continuation to this. 25th deceptive fact. The idea that D-Day was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It's a satisfying narrative. The Allies storm the beaches, France is liberated, Germany is doomed. But by June 6, 1944, Germany was already losing. The Soviet Union had turned the tide on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad, Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine. By mid-1944, Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly westward. Germany had lost air superiority over the Reich. German cities were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. German industry was declining due to loss of territory, resources, and bombing damage. D-Day opened a crucial second front that forced Germany to divide its forces and accelerated the end. But the outcome was already determined. The Soviet Union could have defeated Germany without D-Day, though it would have taken longer and cost even more Soviet lives. D-Day's importance in popular memory reflects Western-centric narratives. From a Soviet perspective, the decisive battles were in the East. Now here's a fact rarely discussed. 26th deceptive fact that Nazi Germany was scientifically and technologically superior to the Allies. Jet aircraft, V-2 rockets, Tiger tanks. Germany had wonder weapons. And yes, Germany developed some advanced technologies, but technological superiority didn't translate into victory. German jet fighters came too late and in too few numbers. The V-2 rocket was technologically impressive, but militarily ineffective. It cost more to produce than the damage it caused. Tiger tanks were formidable but mechanically unreliable, fuel-hungry and produced in small numbers. Meanwhile, the Allies developed superior radar, proximity fuses, code-breaking computers, and ultimately atomic weapons. American and British aviation technology was equal or superior in most respects. Soviet tank design was highly effective. The T-34 was arguably better than most German tanks. The Manhattan Project was the largest and most successful scientific military program of the war. The myth of German technological superiority persists partly because advanced German designs were captured and studied after the war, and partly because it's more comfortable to believe Germany lost due to numbers rather than Allied innovation. From here on, it gets even stranger. 27th deceptive fact. The claim that Hitler's decision to stand and fight rather than allow retreats was purely irrational stubbornness. The no-retreat orders are infamous. German armies surrounded, Hitler forbidding withdrawal, resulting in disaster, Stalingrad being the prime example. It's portrayed as fanatical madness, but there was a logic, however flawed. In the Soviet winter of 1941 to 42, Panicked retreats could have turned into rout and collapse. Hitler's insistence on holding positions arguably prevented total disintegration. German generals later blamed Hitler's no-retreat policy for defeats, but sometimes retreating in Russian winter with inadequate logistics could have been worse than staying put. The problem was Hitler applied this inflexibly. At Stalingrad, a fighting withdrawal might have saved the Sixth Army. Instead, Hitler insisted they hold, then refused permission to break out, resulting in total destruction. His interference was disastrous in many cases, but not every standfast order was irrational. The generals who blamed everything on Hitler were partly deflecting their own failures. And what about this moment? 28th deceptive fact that the war ended on May 8, 1945 in Europe, and September 2nd, 1945 in the Pacific, and peace immediately followed. Legally, yes, those are the dates of German and Japanese surrender, but the violence didn't stop. Millions of displaced persons wandered Europe. Ethnic cleansing occurred in Eastern Europe. Germans expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. Resistance movements continued fighting in the Baltic states and Ukraine against Soviet occupation. Civil wars erupted. Greece, China. In Asia, independence movements fought colonial powers returning to reclaim their empires. The chaos and violence of the immediate post-war period killed hundreds of thousands more people. The transition from war to peace was messy, protracted, and for many people the suffering continued long after the official surrender dates. Let's examine further. 29th deceptive fact that the Nuremberg trials delivered comprehensive justice for Nazi crimes. The trials were historically important, the first major prosecution of leaders for waging aggressive war and crimes against humanity. They established precedents for international law. But comprehensive justice? Far from it. Only a tiny fraction of perpetrators were prosecuted. Many escaped, fled to South America, or were quietly employed by Western intelligence agencies or the new West German government. The trials focused on major leaders. Lower-level perpetrators, the thousands who implemented the Holocaust, often escaped punishment. Some Nazi scientists were recruited by the United States in Operation Paperclip. The Soviets conducted their own trials with different standards. Justice was selective and incomplete, and the Allies themselves were never held accountable for their actions. Victor's justice. Nuremberg was significant but shouldn't be romanticized as delivering complete accountability. Now it's time to go further. 30th deceptive fact. The idea that World War II was inevitable after the Treaty of Versailles and the rise of Hitler. Historical determinism, once Hitler came to power, war was unavoidable. This relieves everyone else of agency and responsibility. But at multiple points, different decisions could have changed outcomes. If the Western powers had enforced the Versailles Treaty when Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, Hitler might have been stopped. If Britain and France had supported Czechoslovakia in 1938 instead of appeasing Hitler at Munich, the balance might have shifted. If the Soviet Union and Western powers had formed an alliance against Germany in 1939 instead of Stalin signing the pact with Hitler, perhaps war could have been avoided or shaped differently. Choices mattered. Treating the war as inevitable removes moral responsibility from the leaders who enabled Hitler's aggression through appeasement, miscalculation, or cynical self-interest. Here's the crucial moment. 31st deceptive fact that the United States entered the war primarily to fight fascism and defend democracy. That's the noble narrative. America as the arsenal of democracy, fighting for freedom. And certainly American soldiers believed they were fighting for those ideals. But American entry into the war was prompted by Pearl Harbor, a direct attack not by European fascism or the Holocaust. The United States had stayed neutral for over 2 years while Europe burned. American businesses continued trading with Germany. There was significant isolationist sentiment. Even after war began, the American military initially prioritized the Pacific theater. The Europe First strategy was a strategic decision based on Germany being the greater threat, not moral outrage over Nazi actions. American support for democracy was selective. The US allied with Stalin's Soviet Union, hardly a democratic state. After the war, the US supported authoritarian regimes if they were anti-communist. The idea of a purely moral crusade is simplistic. National interest, security concerns, and strategic calculations drove American policy, wrapped in idealistic rhetoric. This is where things become truly revealing. 30-second deceptive fact: the narrative that the Holocaust was unique and unprecedented, something unimaginable before it happened. The Holocaust was indeed unique in its industrial scale, systematic planning, and totality of intent, the complete annihilation of an entire people. But unprecedented, genocides and mass atrocities were not new. The Armenian genocide by Ottoman Turkey during World War I killed over 1 million people. Colonial genocides in Africa and the Americas had occurred. Forced starvation in Soviet Ukraine killed millions in the 1930s. The scale and methods of the Holocaust were new, but the fundamental evil, mass murder of civilians based on ethnicity or ideology, had precedence. Treating the Holocaust as utterly unique can make it seem like an aberration, something that couldn't happen again. But genocide has happened repeatedly since World War II: Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. The Holocaust should be a warning about human capacity for organized evil, not an incomprehensible anomaly. And finally, the last detail. 33rd deceptive fact: that we fully understand World War II and its lessons are clear and settled. 70 years of scholarship, countless books, documentaries, films. Surely we know everything important. But history keeps being rewritten as new evidence emerges. Perspectives shift and priorities change. Archives open. New testimonies surface. What seemed certain gets questioned. The role of intelligence operations becomes clearer. Collaboration in occupied countries gets re-examined. Allied bombing campaigns face ethical scrutiny. The contributions of colonies and non-Western participants get recognized. Myths that served post-war political purposes get dismantled. The history taught in different countries varies enormously. Russian and American accounts of the war emphasize different events, different heroes, different villains. Even basic questions remain debated. Could the war have been prevented? When was Germany's defeat inevitable? How necessary were the atomic bombs? What was the most decisive theatre? We'll never have complete objective truth about something as vast and complex as World War II. Every generation reinterprets it through its own concerns and values. So, what are we left with? World War II remains the defining conflict of the 20th century, but our understanding of it is built on layers of myth, propaganda, selective memory, and political convenience. The good versus evil narrative, while true in the broadest sense, obscures messy realities, moral compromises, and uncomfortable truths. The heroic stories we tell serve important purposes, honoring sacrifice, teaching lessons, providing meaning, but they also hide complexity. Were the Allies morally superior to the Axis? Absolutely. Did they fight a clean war free of atrocities? Number. Was Germany defeated by superior Allied strategy and resources? Yes. Were they also hampered by Hitler's incompetence and Nazi ideology? Also yes. Did technology and intelligence win the war? Partly, but so did industrial production, logistics, and millions of soldiers. Was the war inevitable? Perhaps not, but once begun, the outcome was determined by fundamental imbalances in power. The truth is that World War II contained multitudes: heroism and atrocity, brilliance and stupidity, moral clarity and profound ambiguity. 80 years later, we're still arguing about what it meant and what lessons to draw. Maybe that's exactly as it should be. History isn't a settled account. It's an ongoing conversation about who we were and who we want to be. And perhaps the most dangerous deception of all is thinking we've fully understood and learned everything we need to know from the most destructive conflict in human history.